The RBMK did not begin as a revolution of reactor theory in the Soviet Union, but an evolution as new design limitations and theories came to the forefront of the process. In fact, to understand it, we need to go all the way back to the early 1900s and follow the life and death of one man, whose impact on Soviet nuclear science was both incredibly huge and entirely forgotten. You have probably heard his name before on my channel. His name was Savily Feinberg, and his ideas gave birth to the RBMK. On December 24th, 1910, Savily Moiseyevich Feinberg was born in the city of Baku, now the capital of Azerbaijan. As a child of Armenian descent, he had to endure constant attacks, particularly from two Turkish invasions in 1918 and 1920. But there was something special about this young man, something that made him a prodigy of his class. His incredibly adept skill in mathematics, and, more generally, to understand complex subjects almost instantly. Feinberg himself recalled how, during lectures, he would simply close his eyes and imagine what the lecturer was saying, not bothering to take notes. Teachers would have him come up to the front, assuming he was asleep, and he could confidently and correctly recite their lessons. At the same time, he could leave for school or work in his slippers. In 1932, Feinberg graduated from the Institute of Petroleum, and stayed there for his postgraduate studies. However, in 1934, he was transferred to work designing machinery used in the oil fields of Azerbaijan. But this was still not enough for his mind. He turned to a new and emerging field of physics, quantum mechanics. And, as he always had, he took to it, getting into communication with many of the big names in Soviet science. Sensing his prowess, they encouraged him to move away from mathematics and forge a name for himself as a physicist. But this path was interrupted by a foreign threat: Germany and the Great Patriotic War. In 1942, Feinberg began lecturing soldiers on how to properly aim artillery at their targets, and a year later he was drafted to fight. This led to a very tragic day for Feinberg. It is worth mentioning that he had flat feet, and so long stretches of walking became painful for the 33-year-old man. So they just put him in a cart and carted him about. Near the south of the Dnieper River, Feinberg and his comrades came under a German air raid. While everyone else scrambled for cover, Feinberg was too lazy and just lay there. A bomb exploded extremely close by, and it was all he could do to shield his face with his arms. In hospital, it was assumed Feinberg would be a goner. And he really should have been. When he was discharged, Feinberg left the hospital missing his left arm. It had been amputated at the elbow. In his right arm, he suffered an ulnar nerve palsy, leaving his smallest finger and ring finger paralysed. But his other three fingers remained functioning, and Feinberg could still write. His jaw had also been badly injured, and to hide that, well, he grew a beard. Feinberg temporarily returned to Baku. His parents died at the start of the war. There was nothing left for him here, and so he decided to forge a new path, finally taking that place among the greats of physics. Feinberg had a cousin, Evgeny Feinberg. Savily asked him to introduce him to Igor Kurchatov, then the leader of the Soviet atomic bomb project. Evgeny described Savily like this: "I have a cousin who is a mathematician by nature, but a civil engineer. He worked in shell theory. I am sure he will be useful to you. He's smarter than me." "Smarter than you," Kurchatov replied. "Well, that's a characteristic. Well, bring him in." Evgeny brought Savily to Kurchatov, and he was almost immediately accepted into this elite circle of scientists. Evgeny began to teach Savily the principles of nuclear physics, and rapidly Savily outclassed him, quickly becoming Kurchatov's right-hand man in nuclear reactors. He also used connections from this to get a new left-hand prosthesis from Germany, which did not just serve as a decorative manner, but also as a blunt weapon, hitting someone so hard he broke it on one occasion. Feinberg didn't just rapidly rise to the top on his ability to learn, however, but also his ability to rapidly problem-solve. Some of the Soviet Union's earliest nuclear reactors were assembled from graphite stacks. But when they prepared to start one of them up, under Feinberg's supervision, there was a problem. The reactor did not go critical. Feinberg, in charge of the calculations for these reactors, was set to be flown to Moscow to explain to Lavrenti Beria himself why it had failed. Feinberg quickly drew up some calculations and found that too many neutrons were escaping out from unloaded channels in the reactor. Workers rushed to shape the graphite blocks into dimensions that would fill the channels. When they did, the reactor successfully reached criticality. Feinberg's flight to meet with Beria was cancelled. You may notice something here. These industrial reactors that Feinberg is working on look awfully like RBMKs. We will get there, but already the evolution may be apparent. You'll also recognise a couple of the names beneath Feinberg, following his instructions. The construction of these early nuclear reactors was supervised by Nikolai Dolezal and Anatoly Alexandrov. In 1958, the USSR launched EI-2, their first dual-purpose reactor, capable of producing both plutonium and generating electricity through steam turbines. This was also a uranium graphite reactor, like Reactor A in Chelyabinsk, like the experimental ones in Moscow. With the startup of EI-2, there was now interest in the scientific community in these dual-purpose reactors. So much so, a new sector dedicated to them was formed. Sector 15. While Feinberg did not manage it, he was effectively leading their scientific development, pushing forward with the physics calculations and guiding their operation. Feinberg had a lot on his plate. By 1965, there were 10 of these reactors, all of which he was managing. Meanwhile, Alexandrov was working on the SM reactor, not to be confused with small module reactors. The SM reactor is an experimental reactor used to form trans-plutonium elements, located in Dimitrovgrad, not the graphite-moderated reactors Feinberg is designing. There were, naturally, problems with the industrial reactors that Feinberg was designing at Sector 15. Difficulties in loading the reactor, the amount and quality of the plutonium produced, and the overall cost-effectiveness of the reactor. In response to this, Feinberg had a new idea. The RBM reactor. A reactor capable of 1,000 megawatts of electricity. A prototype was quickly developed, the ADE reactor, and many key decisions were made. Zirconium alloy piping was used to maximize the pressure to 50 to 70 atmospheres. The reactor had minimal boiling, only on the surface of the fuel element shells, and the reactor used a steam generator, effectively a heat exchanger, with 2 circuits. One water circuit that passed through the reactor and the heat exchanger, and the other that went from the heat exchanger to the steam turbine. The water consumption was high, and the steam generator system was huge. Even the RBM seemed to be plagued by a poor cost-effectiveness. Feinberg had met his theoretical match, trying to solve the RBM. Countless seminars were dedicated to fixing these problems. For example, reducing the water flow through the reactor and increasing the steam content exiting the reactor to the steam generators at maximum power. These ideas were calculated, but it still wasn't enough. Feinberg needed more. We're now in the summer of 1964, and Feinberg decided to leave the USSR for Geneva, Switzerland, where the 3rd annual conference on the peaceful uses of atomic energy was being held. Countless scientists around the world were gathered, with heavy focus on General Electric and their breakthrough on boiling water reactors. Feinberg listened with interest and learned of what had proved to be the most crucial breakthrough of the boiling water reactor. They could significantly reduce the coolant flow to the reactor by increasing the steam content exiting out of the core, and then bypassing the steam generators and sending this lightly radioactive steam to the turbines. He also learned from the British about their work on channel reactors, specifically the steam-generating heavy water reactor, and how their studies had shown that they could increase the coolant steam voids in a channel to 30% and completely remove the steam generators entirely. Feinberg's problems were solved. He returned to the USSR and delivered a seminar, which ended with, We are stopping discussions and counting on the RBM dual-circuit reactor. We are working on a reactor with boiling in channels, with steam separators and supply of activated steam directly to the turbines. We are working on the RBMK 1000 reactor. By that very autumn, the design specifications for the RBMK 1000 had been drawn up. Every single solution for a design issue with the industrial reactors was thrown into the specifications, ballooning the project scale, and so a separate engineering department for the RBMK was created. Prototypes were assembled, and calculations were made. At this time, something curious emerged. Calculations of the neutron distribution showed that the formation of voids would sometimes lead to positive void coefficients. There was concern initially, but then they thought of the CANDO, which also had a positive void coefficient and operated normally. And so they decided to instead test it on the full-scale RBMK, which was being built at the Leningrad nuclear power plant. That was not Feinberg's decision, however. They wanted to create a prototype RBMK, but the government refused, instead telling them to use the ADE reactor, effectively an RBM. Severely pressed the government, however, and they were able to create a prototype at Chelyabinsk 40, with one channel. In the late 60s, as the RBMK took shape, and the construction of Leningrad Unit 1 began, Feinberg realised that they could increase the power even more. Computational work and calculations were performed, with the plan to increase the electrical output by 50%. And with that, the RBMK 1500 was born. Calculations and computation were, of course, critical to a man like Feinberg, and his closest assistant shared those beliefs. Alexander Rumyantsev. In 1966, he started working alongside Feinberg, after causing quite a problem for Nikiet. You see, Rumyantsev was considered so incredible that as a young, recently graduated specialist at Nikiet, Feinberg decided to pinch him and transfer him to the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy with a huge promotion. When explaining himself to Nikolai Dolezal, in charge of Nikiet, it emerged that Rumyantsev had signed off so many invoices for Nikiet workers to use computers in Moscow between 1965 and 66 that it exceeded Nikiet's budget by several times. There was a lot of anger at this, but somehow, despite almost bankrupting Nikiet, Dolezal never mentioned this once when Feinberg brought Rumyantsev to meetings as his assistant. Rumyantsev began to analyse the reactor, using his computer software, and noticed a few peculiarities that never materialised in human calculations. For example, the double-humped power distribution, where there were hotspots of greater power at the bottom and top of the core. At powers below 5%, the greatest hotspot of power would shift from the top of the reactor to the bottom. There was an extreme non-uniformity in the reactor. So bizarre that aligning control rods on opposite sides of the reactor would cause the reactor to become more unstable. This instability would decrease as the reactor power increased, and the coolant water entering the reactor decreased as well. The most bizarre calculations came from analysing these low power states. In one situation, running the reactor at powers below 5% and with 6 pumps active, withdrawing control rods close to the edge of the core, where neutron reflectors were located, while inserting the opposite one could lead to a scenario where the reactor power in the local area below the control rod being withdrawn would dramatically increase, causing a temperature increase 10 times greater than it could be removed, leading to a partial meltdown. In another, partial immersion of control rods at low power levels could cause localized runaways at the edge of the core, with an explosive yield of 20 tons of TNT. In June of 1973, Rumyantsev's computer program served as his dissertation for the degree of Candidate of Physical and Mathematical Sciences, with these potentially disastrous scenarios removed. His defense was overseen by a council headed by Anatoly Alexandrov, with Weinberg acting as deputy. In the end, the defense was successful. Meanwhile, Weinberg had become completely disillusioned with the RBMK project. As a man who from his childhood had been obsessed with maths and understanding the world, he'd never encountered something before that seemed to fight calculations, where even computer modelling seemed to prove barely powerful enough to understand it. In September of 1973, Weinberg was appointed chairman of the State Commission for the launch of the RBMK 1000 reactor at Unit 1 of the Leningrad nuclear power plant. After being informed on the proceedings there, he returned to Moscow and called in Rumyantsev, perhaps the only person who could understand his disillusionment with the RBMK project. "Sasha," he said, "we have created something that the human mind cannot comprehend. We will launch the reactor by November 7th. Only 30 to 40 channels. And then we will return to your calculations. By the time we get to the full loading of the active zone, we will have time to check everything again and clarify it." Weinberg then took a flight to a conference in Tbilisi, capital of the Georgian SSR. While there, he fell ill and had to be flown back to Moscow, where he was diagnosed with a terminal illness. Still, he wished to be kept up to date with the RBMK project. He asked one of his colleagues from the beginning of RBM development, Chebotarev, to observe the startup and report back to him. When Chebotarev returned, on October 20th, 1973, and confirmed that Leningrad Unit 1 had been launched successfully, Weinberg replied with, "Fortune favours the foolish." Chebotarev left, and Weinberg's wife entered. A few minutes later, she left the room once more. He had passed away. The birth of the RBMK had come with the death of its creator, and with it came a fundamental shift in direction for its future. In particular, there was no direct successor for the development he'd overseen from the start. Sure, you might say Rumyantsev, the man who had analysed it and observed the massive safety deficiencies that needed to be analysed. But he had freshly joined the council and was soon to depart to work for the IAEA. Instead, development of the RBMK project progressed to the more practically obvious choices, under the collective work of the Kurchatov Institute and Nikiet, led by Alexandrov and Dolezal respectively. Weinberg's contributions were effectively buried. In February of 1975, scientific study of the RBMK reactor was stopped. Rumyantsev's computer program and the results were transferred from the Kurchatov Institute. A few months later, Leningrad Unit 1 suffered a catastrophic accident. Rumyantsev, hearing about this while back in Moscow before being transferred to another role in the IAEA, suggested using the calculations he made as the incident bore striking resemblance to one of the calculated accidents from 2 years earlier. When Rumyantsev left again, all his calculations and the software program used were destroyed. Many of those who worked on the RBMK project from the beginning moved on. The deputy scientific director, Kunigin, passed away in 1983. Viktor Sidorenko, who became the head of the nuclear reactor department, created after the launch of the RBMK, was transferred to another organisation, Gozatomnadzor. Alexandrov had become the president of the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union. All of this had left the management of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, and by de facto the management of the entire RBMK project, in the hands of one man. A very influential and powerful man in the Kurchatov Institute, well connected to politics. That man was Valery Alexeyevich Legasov.